Welcome to Detoxicity. By men, about men, for everyone. This is a podcast that's attempting to remix the narrative around masculinity, and I thank you for listening and supporting. If you're new to the podcast, I hope you check out the archive, which contains over 150 episodes. I'm always happy when someone reaches out with a friendly word or constructive criticism, so never hesitate to hit me up either via IG at DetoxPodGuy or via email, detoxpod@gmail.com. You can also contact me if you're interested in being a guest on the show or if you know someone who might be a good guest for the show. There's also a Detoxicity Patreon. Patrons get episodes 1 week early, plus I will mail you a cool DetoxPod fridge magnet. Go to bit.ly/DetoxPodPlus to find out more. Oh, one more thing. Late last year, I completed my certification courses, and I am now a life and relationship coach. I'm taking clients. Go to mike-joseph.com and book a free consultation. Thanks for listening. I really do appreciate you. And now we have our third four-time guest on the show. Joining Dylan Thomas and Kevin Patterson is Ryan Bentham. Ryan, aka Prof, is the co-host of the podcast Life on the Swingset, which I was very fortunate to have been a part of for a couple of years. I think 2017 to 2019 or something like that. What is time? What are years? But Ryan and I have grown a friendship as a result of our appearances on that podcast, even though they didn't totally overlap. I sort of subbed in while Ryan was out dealing with a medical issue, which we talk about on his first appearance, and we talk about again here. And we're bringing Ryan back, and we have some other things to talk about in addition to his moving through the world with a disability and how that has affected him over the years. We talk about turning 50 and appreciating midlife and kind of rethinking how you define manliness, which obviously is a core tenet of the show, how you define strength. We talk about empty nesting, which I mistakenly thought Ryan was experiencing, and he is not totally. But we also, within that, there is also raising boys into men. Not raising boys to men, the group, that would be weird, but, having male children and guiding them and watching them become male adults and sort of sending them away to be the best version of themselves. We talk about the work that he continues to do. We talk about how his relationship and sex life has changed since the pandemic started in 2020. We talk about evolving sexuality and evolving ideas around masculinity. That's affected him as well. So just so much stuff to talk about. Great conversation. Ryan is so wise and so thoughtful. So I hope that you feel some of that wisdom and thoughtfulness as you're listening. Everybody, Ryan Bentham in the house.
So I'm super excited to be back on the show. Really been excited to see how the show has developed over the years and to be able to continue to support it in all the ways possible. So blessings to you, and thank you for doing the work that you've been doing and have the conversations that you've been having. So I'm Ryan Bentham, and I am part of Life on the Swingset and really have been part of that world for well over a decade now, as Ginger and I have been really polyamorous and open in our own relationship, and then finding our way to being polyamorous through that period of time. And Ginger is the expert of us, but I am very much owning that through both my own experiences and my study. I have a voice to contribute, and I'm excited to have a conversation with you today and see where things go as it relates to any variety of topics.
Sweet. So when we initially talked, or the one time that we've done a chat for the show where it was just you and me, we've done a couple with Kevin and Dylan as well. I am not sure that you were an empty nester at that point, and you definitely are now.
Ish. So we have the myth of the empty nest. One of our children is down your way in Brooklyn, making his own way, doing a great job. Really excited to see him coming into his own and being able to be a small town kid, being successful in the big city. Our younger son is living at home with us as he is getting ready to be an entrepreneur and launch his own business. So not empty nest from a physical perspective, but at that phase where we are really consciously evolving the way that we have parented our two children as they are adults, and trying to really update our framework of how we relate to them and how we can best support them for the stage that they're at in their own lives.
And what does that look like with two men who are now in their early 20s? You have raised two men successfully. What does that look like in terms of still nurturing them and being present for them? How has that relationship changed?
A really amazing question. And part of the way that I would respond to that, Mike, is by calling back on some of the research that Allison Armstrong has done in a book called Understanding Men. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that work at
Mm-mm.
all. It's a really fantastic resource, and I would certainly encourage you and anybody else listening to the show to check her out. I listened to her book, and she's got a number of books, but this one in particular around Understanding Men is based on her academic research of men as we move through different phases in our life. And to me, that was really eye-opening because I could clearly reflect on my own experience as a cisgender man of having experienced many of those phases, all of those phases, and then really more than anything, having the perspective of life is different for my children than it was for me, but there are themes and patterns of energy that are very similar as we move from what she would call kind of a knightly phase, which is about adventuring, kind of finding our place in the world, into a prince phase of starting to build something, kind of putting a stake in the ground, so to speak. We have that intrinsic motivation. In many cases, it's around provider energy for those people in our lives. And both of my children are squarely in that early prince phase. So I use that as kind of an archetype or a framework from an energy perspective to know how to relate to them. And Alison Armstrong in her research has a lot of really practical advice for how to support that. For example, it's less about telling them about how to do things and more about being curious as it relates to what kind of resources they feel like they need to be successful. And one of the things that Ginger and I have done since the beginning of parenting is really creating a lot of autonomy within our children, helping them learn how to make decisions on their own. And that has served them well their entire life. And I would say it's serving them that much more as they've entered into early adulthood and being the princes that they are now. So really understanding that each of their needs is unique to them, and it's up to them, and it's important for them to really tune into and figure out what can help them move forward with more confidence as a man in the world. And I'm grateful to say that both of them have taken in the ethos to be men that are very good people in the world, like very conscientious of their own privilege and aren't showing up in spaces in ways that are destructive or harmful to others around them. So they've got a strong foundation from that perspective. And it's really about helping them on each of their different paths, identify and support them in whatever really they can identify as needing to be successful for themselves in their own lives.
That's awesome. And do you find that as they grow, like, as a not parent, one thing
Mhm.
that I've always kind of looked at in an interesting way is what I see from my elders and my caretakers is almost kind of a perpetual infantilization where I'm 47 years old and sometimes I think my elders still think I'm 10. Um, and
Mhm.
there's got to be some interesting calculus when you raise somebody, but now you're like, oh shit, they're 23 years old. This is a fully formed adult person capable of making their own decisions, paying their own bills. How do you do that math in your head? Or is it difficult for you to do that math in your head?
No, I think it's important. First of all, what you're giving voice to is really important to do consciously. And it really, to me, comes down to seeing them within the light of their own evolution. That is to say, none of us are fixed, but it's easy, to your point, however we think of that, it's easy to have a relationship with our children that is in a, I wouldn't say a fixed point in time, but it kind of holds them to a certain behavior that, like, for example, I'll share with you, I have an older brother. I'm the youngest of two boys in my family. And as a 51-year-old man, my mother will still call me her baby. I don't think
That's
she
it.
means that. She means it from a very endearing perspective. But to your point, there is energy behind that where there has not, for her, not as a criticism, there has not been a conscious changing of how she thinks of me in that way. And, I think a lot of the ways that I relate to her still kind of fall within that energy pattern, that kind of way of thinking. And Ginger and I have made a very conscious decision to relate to both of our adult children differently. And part of it even is in the language that we use. Like we've always talked about our children as our boys. And it's like now that they're not boys, they're grown ass men. I catch myself hiccuping over, oh, the men, the guys. So it's kind of like reflective even of our language, weirdly, of how do we relate to them and how can we mindfully relate to them differently at a different phase in their life? Because what they needed when they were truly boys is very different than what they need now, even if there are some aspects that are common as it relates to helping them make decisions on their own, to have sovereignty and autonomy as humans moving about the world, which is not a common experience for a lot of children, by the way. I certainly didn't have that when I was growing up. So that in and of itself may be a common denominator, but holding them in that framework does not serve them well. So to your question, Mike, it's really, how do we reinvent the relationship with them given where they are now? And we're still their parents. I'm still their parent. I'm still their father, but I'm not the father that I was when they were 10 and 12.
Right. Yeah, that's got to be, again, I'm a not parent, so this is all fresh perspective for me and stuff that I don't think about very often, because I'm never going to be in your shoes in that way. But it is interesting to me because I can relate that back to how my parents see me as now a middle-aged person moving through the world. I gotta ask, how is your health? That was a big talking point of our previous conversation.
Yeah, my health. Thanks for checking in, by the way. It's great. I feel fantastic.
You look wonderful.
Thank you. So, for people who don't recall, back over 100 episodes ago, I did have a series of strokes about 7 years ago that I'm still experiencing disability from and recovering from in many ways. But really, overall, Mike, what I would say is I don't feel victim to it. In fact, I have a lot of gratitude for what it has opened up in me, both spiritually and more recently, I've actually started some new therapy and been able to improve my left hand and arm functionality pretty significantly in a pretty short period of time.
It's
So,
awesome.
it's that kind of life where I've adapted in many ways and I have a lot of happiness and satisfaction and peace of mind that I didn't have before my strokes. And I have more recently also been able to enjoy a lot more movement and get back into some things that felt out of touch for a long time. So thanks for checking in on that. It's been a powerful journey for sure.
Of course. Yeah, I would imagine that there is a lot that you have to recalibrate after an event like that. Even 7 years later, like you're still, as you said, attempting to regain complete movement and all of that stuff. And I met you after you had these strokes. You've not looked at the thing that happened to you as a hindrance or something to hold you back. You've always just kind of operated as business as usual. I'm going to kick the shit out of this thing. So I applaud it.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I feel like a common thread for me has to be owning my power where I can get it. And that morphed quite a bit. I had a lot of limitations. And what I would say over the years is that it's a challenge, but I can't make that wrong. It's my path. And if I try to invalidate part of my path, essentially I'm invalidating part of who I am, or trying to deny who I am, or even I think more problematically, potentially starting to have resentment around who I am or how my body works. And it has been a long journey myself to try to get to a place of really full and complete acceptance. I've had morsels of positivity through all of my experience, but that kind of affirmation oriented language in some cases only goes so far, if you know what I mean.
Right.
At some point you're like, okay, I'm using my affirmations and that's creating a basis for me that doesn't make me feel like a victim to this, but I'm not whole. I'm not feeling 100% whole yet. And over the last really 2 to 3 years, interestingly, with the pandemic, I had the opportunity given to me, weirdly, it's weird to say that, to be a lot less social. So I didn't have to try to present in a certain way that seemed like I was fitting in. And I shared on our first conversation about this on your show before, where I have a lot of privilege as it relates to how my body does work. And there's an assumption among most people that I interact with that I'm quote unquote normal, or that my body works just like everybody else's,
Right.
whatever that means. So to have had the time during the pandemic where I wasn't having to face that, for lack of a better word, was in many ways, I think, healing in and of itself. Because it was allowed me to really kind of come to full terms with who I am and how my body works and what that means. Mourn some of the things that I may not be able to do ever again, or it might take a long time for me to do. And I've also played around with adapting. I mean, sounds weird in the way, but one example, Mike, would be like, well, I grew up, I loved golfing.
Okay.
I kind of grew up on a golf course, a small town in the Midwest. And I would get dropped off at the golf course early on in the day and then just literally do laps playing by myself or joining other groups all day long. So that was my passion. I really loved golf. And when coming back to my children, when we had them, I made a conscious choice to stop golfing. Really out of the idea that I loved that for myself, but contextually, I was also traveling a lot for work at the time, and recognized that leaving for 4 to 5 hours on a weekend every weekend to go indulge myself around golf was not something I wanted to do. I did that very mindfully, and then fast forward 15, 16 years later, I have these strokes out of nowhere, and then the rug was really pulled out from that passion of mine. I was like, I can't go back to golfing. But the reason I was sharing that is because what I have learned and what I've been doing recently is understanding that there are different ways to do that. More specifically, I came across the Meta VR headset, and there's a golf application, and actually you can buy a club to mimic what it feels like to really golf, even though it's in the virtual world. So I can do that with my well-functioning hand, and I play regularly, so to speak, online now. And it scratches that same itch, so to speak. So it's kind of figuring out different hacks, for lack of a better word, to have that same or similar passion come through, given my realities of what I can actually do or not do.
That's awesome that you can do that. Technology is so wonderful in that it
It
allows
is.
you
And we
so
live in the
many ways
future.
to, so many ways to not fix isn't the right word, to make adjustments, right? Things that you would not have been able to, like, had this been 30 years ago, golf would have not been an option for you in any way, shape, or form.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a meta theme in many ways for my entire experience. Because 30 years ago, the mindset, first of all, 30 years ago, the surgery that saved my life didn't exist.
Wow.
So, we would not be literally having this
In this
conversation as a
conversation, yeah.
result of just that base, you know, medical technology, medical marvel kind of stuff. So I'm grateful for that, but I also realize that neuroplasticity and really the idea that our brains are not fixed, that we have the capacity to regenerate a lot of function. And I've experienced that in my life. I couldn't walk when I left the hospital. I ambulate very easily around the world now. So there are a lot of differences. Cognitively, I had a big number of challenges. There's a concept called left neglect, where literally my brain was not registering the entire left side of my body's experience.
Wow.
So somebody could be standing right to my left, and it was like they didn't exist. Like my brain just, this is our perception. This is the reality that it becomes accentuated when it's not working as it should. But I was literally blind to a real object on my left side, which to me is a really interesting analogy for how we all experience the world. Again, mine is on the extreme side. I always tend to go to the far end of the spectrum to learn the lesson, but that still happens for all of us. We still experience the world through our own eyes and through our own senses as if that is reality, when in fact somebody else with a different pair of eyes and a different pair of senses is experiencing that same quote unquote reality in a very different way. So it is like such a strong metaphor for me to, again, have the extreme example of realizing and being surprised of things that are on a particular side of my body, because I had this traumatic brain injury that eliminated that from my consciousness. It just deleted it from my awareness. And then for me, it started to come back, but the lesson still stuck, which is, wrong to think that we can accurately see the things that are in front of us. We see them as we are. We might see what we want to see deliberately out of ignorance or bias, but that also happens involuntarily for all of us. So I've been really playing around with that idea a lot of what else am I blind to?
Right.
And how can I either open myself up to that or recognize that what I'm seeing in my world isn't necessarily true universally. Does that make sense?
It totally makes sense.
We just
And
went super deep here.
I mean, we did, and that's totally fine. That's something that I think about a lot, and has become kind of a recurring topic of discussion over the course of this podcast. Is everyone has unique experiences. Like the lives that we live are different from one another in very specific and unique ways. And that's going to mean that perspectives are going to be different on any of a million different things. And we need to all kind of take that into account when we're dealing with one another, that you, Ryan, and me, Mike, have lived very, very different lives. And the experiences that you had that might lead you to a particular conclusion or a particular thought are going to be different from the thoughts and experiences that might lead me to a particular conclusion. And you figure out a way to, I don't know if it's split the difference or find common ground or even just explain the way that you got there. And I don't think that people are necessarily, not to cast a wide net, I don't know that people are willing to have those discussions or think those thoughts these days as much, or if they ever were.
Right. Yeah. Well, I feel like, and by the way, thanks for sharing that. It certainly helps me feel a lot less crazy. But I think that the takeaway is we do all come from different experiences. And what is a challenge is we also have a certain way that we relate to the world through our senses. And in many cases, I guess what I would share at the core of what I've reflected on is that connection to reality and however we experience isn't necessarily the truth. It may be my truth in that moment, but it's not necessarily the truth. And
Right.
that's where I feel like our senses can, and our experiences they're formative for us, and they can also mislead us because they can create blind spots. Literally, I had a blind spot in the entire left side of my body out of this brain injury experience. And that is dramatic, but on the same continuum of whether I have an experience of trauma or other mental or spiritual experiences that shut down part of my awareness. So I feel like the takeaway for me has been, don't think that I know it all, if that makes sense. Don't think that I have all the information that other people may have in terms of, and this is even talking about census stuff. So we can go super metaphysical and talk about energies and other types of information that are beyond our senses to experience. It's like the Wi-Fi signal that we're talking on right now. It exists. I can't see it, but just because I can't see it doesn't mean it doesn't exist and not in the background. So there's this like real humbling appreciation for, my gosh, there's all this stuff in my own experience that I am literally blind to. And how can I slow down and start to appreciate that more? Because I do think that part of my reflection, Mike, is that as we move about the world, whether that's as men or just as people, and we're in this world of the future, we live in the future, we have all of this great technology. There's kind of a pulling forward of momentum that makes us even that much more prone to having those blind spots.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It does make
that
sense.
resonate with you?
Yeah. There's a tendency for people to substitute their experience for the experience, when the reality is everyone has their experience and there really is no the experience. So you got to make room for everybody else's experience. Well, it's an empathy thing.
Right. Yeah.
At the end of the day.
Yeah, it very much is.
Yeah.
Right.
It struck me as you were talking a little while ago that we had our first conversation probably in the summer of 2020. So we were knee deep in the pandemic. And even the two subsequent group conversations that we had, the world hadn't really opened up yet at that time.
Right.
How have you, as a human being and as a poly person, ingratiated yourself back into the world over the last couple of years? Like, what is that
very slowly
up?
It feels like it's been a really slow drip. I feel like some of that is kind of getting that desire back, that gear back. Ginger and I have been blessed to go back to Desire a couple times, and it is a super magical part of the world for us. We really enjoy being pampered by being there, and we've met amazing people, but it hasn't got to the level yet where we wanted to have any intimacy with those folks. Our intimate partners have been very consistent through the pandemic as they were before the pandemic. One of those partners is in the midst of creating her own primary relationship right now. So that is something that we're very supportive of. I've always been upfront with her about that if that is where she wanted to take her energy, and that person, as often happens, and this is the second time this has happened to us. Our very first partner was a woman who identified as a lesbian and said, I want to have a wife someday. And we were like, that's amazing. We want that for you as well. And when she started a relationship that she is actually still married to this person now 16 years later,
wow,
there was a long period of time that we didn't hear from her. And that is natural, I would say, because she was choosing to be monogamous, and it was important to her partner. She was upfront with her partner about her relationship with us. But, as they were solidifying their own relationship, it's very natural for them to pull away, from the prior relationship, even if it was a, conscious uncoupling, for lack of a better word. Ginger might not appreciate that term since she's the expert in that area, but that's what I would think of it as. So we're kind of amidst that same process right now with our other partner, our newer partner. So we're seeing how that's developing, but we were able to stay connected to her through the pandemic and have that smaller polycule, so to speak, be how we manifested our polyamory during the time. But other than going to Paradise a couple times, we really haven't gone to a lot of parties or other events. We spoke at some really fun events last year that as educators, it was great for us to kind of get back out and scratch that itch. We are in the process of planning to continue to do work together retreats with couples and folks in all different types of relationships principally around tantric practices. So Ginger is trained in urban tantra with Barbara Corrales. I don't know if you know Barbara Corrales or
I
not,
do not.
but yeah, she has a very inclusive approach to tantra. So it's not heteronormative and very accepting of all folks in terms of how their bodies work and how their energies work. So Ginger went through that training with Barbara Corrales a couple of years ago with our other partner, by the way. And I'm actually on the schedule to be doing it this fall. So kind of going through a reading list of that work, starting with Barbara's book, Urban Tantra, which I think the second edition of it was published about 2017 or 2018. And then, reading Gender Outlaw right now. Are you familiar with that work, Mike?
I'm not. You're schooling me today.
No. So Outlaw, I want to double check the author's name. It is Kate Bornstein.
Okay.
So really kind of, broadening, my understanding. And Kate Bornstein is a trans woman, and she really lays out her own personal journey around gender as a social construct and how it is frankly destructive. It's problematic for a lot of our experiences, and you can speak to that personally a lot more than I can. As a cisgender man who has always felt very comfortable in my own identity and how that manifests. So exposing myself to a lot of the training, and I'm excited for the workshop this fall. That is a long roundabout way to say, to your question, we've been kind of dabbling in getting out post-pandemic of doing some education, doing some vacationing, doing some partying together, being primarily intimate together or with partners that we had pre-pandemic. But I've not felt a strong desire to move in a very different direction.
Yeah, I guess that's what I was ultimately getting at is you are where you are. Are you cool with where you are? Or are you just like moving in a direction slowly as opposed to just kind of being satisfied where you're at?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So if I pause for a moment and just like think about my behavior, there is a big part of me, like from parts of self perspective. So we're going to get serious into some therapy here, Mike. I hope that's okay. One part of me very much loves the kind of protection of the pandemic cave of, again, not having to interact with other people, kind of being more hermit-like. And then the other part of me, has been on field trying to find somebody to date. So I'm also not willing to compromise the person that I would be willing to go out on a date with because of the hermit-like person and the satisfaction that I have with being in our home space and enjoying the beautiful space that we live in and not feel. So it's like I'm open to these experiences, but I'm not really going to pursue them to the point where I'm willing to sacrifice my own happiness or satisfaction today.
Or your health, for that matter.
Or by health, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. And knock on wood, I mean, I have to this point in the pandemic never had COVID, which for my vascular health perspective is fantastic. So that is important to me. I don't move about the world with a lot of fear that I'm going to get COVID, but I take care of myself from a precautions perspective. And it is important to not put myself unnecessarily at risk of that or any other things.
And I appreciate that level of mindfulness. You are, I think, the last person that I have met who has never gotten COVID. So kudos to you for sticking it out for 4.5 years. I hope I don't jinx you.
We're good.
This podcast is by and large about gender and the way that we view masculinity. And I think that I've always, I've never not felt like a man. And I don't know that I've ever said that on an episode of the show before. I've had people who are a bit more gender expansive. I've had trans people on the show, but long before I knew what cisgender was, and that's a term I only heard of probably 7 or 8 years ago, I have never felt like not a guy. My struggle, or if you want to call it that, or my confusion, or the the what's the term I'm looking for? The My sexuality has always been the thing that there has been a bit of a disconnect with, and it's sometimes it's hard to have other people understand the fact that there are lots of folks out there who view gender differently. And it's really interesting to me that, what am I trying to say here? Just, I'm thinking about my own journey and how there are some similarities to your journey. And is there anything about your own journey through masculinity that has evolved or changed or feels different than it did when we spoke in 2020?
Good question. How have I evolved since 2020? How have I related to myself differently since
Yeah,
then?
that was a really long way of asking a very simple question. That was very succinct,
It's
Ryan.
okay. It's good. Yeah, I think the thing that I would offer, Mike, is it feels a lot more fluid. Like I don't feel as attached to relating to myself within that certain way, and really appreciate differently after reading Gender Outlaw how destructive holding on to the binary is, not just for me, but for everybody. And still feeling comfortable with my own decisions and how I relate to myself, but it feels a lot more fluid. Like I know in prior episodes and discussions we had with Kevin, for example, we were discussing the idea of how that expresses through our sexuality and the label of being queer. And
Right, and
I have
particularly with regards to
been
Kevin,
through the kind of mental hurdles around what does that mean for me? Like I don't relate to myself as being queer, but my behavior is very non-heteronormative. So that's the kind of evolution I would say I've gone through. Is there's been a softening of the edges of, you know, I first of all admire the folks that have completely rejected the binary in whatever way for themselves, and certainly through reading of Kate Bornstein's book, how she really lays out the outlaw aspect of that, like how difficult it is to how courageous it is to live outside of those paradigms consciously. So, while I'm not living in that way, it feels like I've had a softening of I don't need to cling on to a certain, identity for safety.
do you think that there, consciously or unconsciously, was a regular or consistent need to, like, claim your straightness or claim your heteronormativity or claim your masculinity, even if you weren't doing it consciously? Do you think that younger you was trying to kind of affirm that publicly?
100%. I mean, one of the early trips of the Swingset, I was known for standing up on top of a bar and pouring champagne down my body. Now, great set of experiences, but a very masculine thing to do to get attention.
Is it?
And I was, buff. Like I was a triathlete, a CrossFitter. I had some muscles. So I related to experiences like that where it was peacocking, for lack of a better word. Not in a, again, destructive way, but when I look back on them, that's exactly what I was doing. So it is very much that. And I don't judge myself for that. I also realize that in myself, there's a lot of what one might call kind of a survival energy behind that. Like I'm trying to demonstrate that I am whatever I am. I can be part of the group. I can, be cool. I can attract a an attractive partner or partners. And I've tried to really let that part of me go, to not be doing things out of a reaction because I'm trying to garner resources for myself because, you know, I live in a very opulent world. I don't face survival every single day of my life. Yet my brain, not just my traumatic brain injury brain, all of our brains are still very hardwired to see the proverbial saber-toothed tiger around the corner, even if that saber-toothed tiger is a to-do list that we didn't get all the way through, or our boss being frustrated with us. And our brains can go to the extreme of interpreting that as threatening our survival, when in reality, getting fired from a job, which happened to me, was a very traumatic experience. I related to it like it was a complete survival experience. But I still had my education. I still had my network. I still had a lot of things that, losing a job involuntarily couldn't be taken away from me. So it was not a survival situation, even if at that time I related to it like it was life and death.
I wonder that as someone who has been fortunate to be working at the same place for almost 20 years, there's going back to the idea of mental calculus. I have this deep seated fear of losing my job. And I kind of have an idea where it comes from. I think there's a part of me that would bristle at like the rejection aspect of it. And, my brother and I talk about this a lot, a survival mode aspect of it, where it's like, oh shit, if I lose my job, I'm going to be, out on the street with like a cardboard box. When the reality is that it would take a lot of things to happen in addition to losing that job for that to happen. And
Right.
one thing I've been working on maybe in the past year or so is to realize, like you said, I've got resources, I've got skills, I've got all of these things, which very likely mean that, if heaven forbid I lose my job tomorrow, I'm not going to be
Mm-hmm.
homeless 3 days later. But you are correct in that there is this like cave person brain. And we're also it's part of it is sort of just generational, but some of it is also conditioned and socialized in us from when we're young that these things are going to happen to you if this thing happens to you. Like this cause equals this effect. And that's not necessarily the reality. But it takes conscious effort to remove yourself from that reality or to change the way you think about that reality.
Yeah. Well, and going back to your original question, the reason that really came up for me in reflecting on your question is that same continuum exists for me when I look at my past behavior as it relates to how I related to myself as a man and being masculine and what that really meant. So, it was about being fit. It was about being strong. I'm not the biggest person around. So it's kind of like, I'll work with what I got. I'm not the greatest athlete in the world, but I'm also pretty stubborn. And so, being able to figure out how to train myself to do an Ironman distance triathlon when several years before that, I didn't even know how to swim, felt like a feat of accomplishment. And I related to that in many ways through that conditioning of, this is me optimizing the kind of guy I can be. And now I relate to that through grateful as having had those experiences, for sure, had the opportunity to do it, and reflecting on what it really meant to me, which had nothing to do with being masculine or a good athlete or being buff or whatever the case was. So instead of that, the question for me now is, where is my inspiration? Who am I inspired to be? As opposed to, how can I look the part? If
And
that is useful.
it's totally useful. And where are you seeking this inspiration? Who and what is inspiring you?
I'm inspired by a lot of this reading that I've been doing, that I've been sharing with you. I think they're all fantastic books. I would love to, have a detoxicity book club
Book
at
club.
some point. I think Understanding Men from Alison Armstrong is just a really foundational. She wrote a book called Understanding Women, which, was a good place for me to start, because I was like, I feel like I understand women. And there was so many aha moments in that particular book that I was like, I wonder what she can helped me see about myself that I didn't see before. So being able to have some of that inspiration through books and resources is huge for me. I think I'd mentioned to you in 2020, because it was still pretty fresh for me, really been working with this book called Quiet Mind, Epic Life, which is
That sounds
an
familiar.
author. His name is Matthew Ferry, and he has really transformed for me a lot of that orientation away from thinking of everything in terms of survival terms and being able to have more of a thriving orientation. And that's huge for me. So really relying heavily on resources of these different perspectives. I would say that's one place. The other thing that I would say is really, more of an introspective practice. By that, I particularly mean taking the time to think about what I really want to be doing, how I want to be spending my time, who I want to be spending my time with, and to consciously move in that direction, as opposed to go through the motions of, yeah, this is what I should be doing. Here are the obligations that I have or that I feel. Those are obligations that I've been able to renegotiate in some ways, where I'm not living by shoulds. I'm really, being much more aware and conscious. I don't know how to avoid that word of, where I'm spending my time, who I'm spending my time with, and why I'm doing all of that. And so it's for the quote unquote right reasons, but right and wrong is its own false dichotomy.
Yes,
So
yes, of
it just
course.
feels like this mix of getting some education, some guidance from elders, for lack of a better word, folks that have written these powerful books. Kate Bornstein's Gender Outlaw book, another great one that we've talked about today, and also having the internal dialogue and work to assess that for myself.
Right on. And one thing you mentioned very briefly at the beginning of our conversation is that you are 51, which means that since the last time I've spoken to you, you've celebrated a milestone birthday.
Indeed.
How is because I've got 50 coming up in a couple of years, and it does feel like a big number to me. How did you approach your 50th birthday? Did you even make a big deal out of it?
I didn't make a big deal out of it. Ginger made a big deal out of it on my behalf, which I appreciated because it brought my awareness to it being a milestone. I mean, I can kind of downplay any sense of attention on me. I mean, I'm a white dude. I get plenty of attention. Thanks, everybody. So, in all seriousness, I'm like, it doesn't need to be about me. And as a wonderful contributing partner to Ginger, helped me see it with the importance that it conveyed. So I really approached it from, being able to let the things from 0 to 50 be what they were. And it's kind of very consistent with what I was just sharing of deliberately seeking to connect with the truest version of myself. Like, said differently, if I'm 50 fucking years old and I'm still shrouding myself to try to show up for other people in a way that makes me feel accepted with all of this privilege that I have, then what the fuck am I doing? Pardon the French.
The French does not need pardoning. That is a really valuable insight, and I wish I knew more people who got to that point in their lives where they were like, oh, like I've hit this whatever marker milestone. It doesn't even have to be a marker or milestone. It can just be I've been on this earth long enough. I should lean in to my truest self.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
Yeah, and share that with the world unapologetically.
Yeah. And I wonder, kind of bringing it full circle, if the experience that you had is what was the catalyst for that kind of accepting yourself and then reflecting that out to others, or whether you think it was going to happen anyway.
100%. As I also alluded to earlier, that is the fulcrum that I was created in. And I am grateful for it with all of its collateral challenges in terms of how I live my day-to-day life with limitations physically. it made me who I am. And it made Ginger and I who we are in our relationship. We had a very strong relationship before that. It killed another one of our relationships from a polyamory perspective. That other third relationship needed to die. I see that very clearly in retrospect that, I was her knight in shining armor. It was not a functional or healthy relationship in that way. And when I had a series of strokes and I couldn't serve that role, she freaked out in a lot of different ways. And yet, really at the core, it just revealed what was already happening beneath the surface. So, that transition brought me to the place, as you were just alluding to or suggesting, that I have now created enough acceptance in myself to be like, this is this is the life that I've lived, and so overwhelming for a lot of folks. And as I even share my story, people kind of shut down. They're like, I don't even know how you did this. And we haven't even touched yet on Ginger's double, preventative mastectomy because of her family's history on breast cancer. We've been through some shit.
Right.
And it is in many ways too much for people. And that started to, in me, start to feel like I was too much for people, or I wasn't right in a certain way. And again, I say that all with this big asterisk of, as the white guy on your podcast, somehow, I wasn't being accepted. So I don't mean to belabor the point, but it
I totally understand it.
It lands to the point of how we choose to move about the world. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, because I did an exercise in a workshop where the facilitator essentially said, think of every negative life experience that you've had up to this point. And take some time to catalog a series of things that you've experienced. And then his next prompt was to say, now, given where you are with some perspective, can you see how every single one of those events led you to something different or better?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Can you do that in your mind as well? Isn't that really interesting?
It is really interesting. And I've thought this for a while. I don't think that I would do a lot of the good things that I currently do, without the bad things that have happened to me in the past.
Mm-hmm. Right. And if that's the case, were they bad things?
That's a really good question.
Or was it just that we were experiencing something that was difficult? Like, life happens. I'm not glossing over that. But we don't have the perspective in the moment to know what is going to, really come out of it, and how that quote unquote bad thing is going to lead to these quote unquote good things. They're all things,
right?
And life is lifing along, and we're just so close to it that we don't have the perspective necessarily. And that with some time, we're able to get the perspective. So that was a powerful set of exercises for me to recontextualize, to use like a $20 word, to think differently about these points of experience in my life, away from kind of being a victim of them, and understanding that at the time they were difficult. I wouldn't want to go through it again. I don't want to have brain surgery again. I don't want to have to see my partner recovering from a preventative double mastectomy. And with time and space, I can appreciate them from the value that they've provided for me, the
Sure.
person that they've helped me become. As painful and challenging as it was in those particular moments, it's been helpful and powerful for me to be able to have that reflective perspective practice of, there's this expression that the guy who wrote Quiet Mind, Epic Life has, which is, it's always going your way, even when it's not. So, but that's a fucking challenging paradigm to hold on to.
Hell yes, it is. Hell yes, it is. But that's also a good way to, like you said, recontextualize things that are going on, and a good thing to apply to the future when you experience bad things.
Yeah, it is. If you can be the Zen master with chaos happening in your life and around you, one is less likely, not you or me. We're all less likely to create unnecessary suffering for ourselves,
Right.
because we can see some of the silver linings, or we can still maintain gratitude for other, parts of this experience that aren't necessarily as painful.
Right. Absolutely. Generally, this is a part of the show where I thank the guest for being on the show, and of course I thank Ryan for being on the show. I thank Ryan every time he's on the show, and I thank Ryan every time I get to cross paths with him, because he is, again, such a thoughtful person, and I love engaging with him. And this is also the part of the show where then I tell you how to get in touch with Ryan. But Ryan ain't really got no social media profiles. I'm looking on Instagram, and there's the Ryan aka Prof handle, but that doesn't appear to have been updated since, I think, 2021, maybe. One of the most recent posts is his first appearance on the show, which was definitely 3 years ago. So you can follow him there, Ryan aka Prof. I just wouldn't expect a lot of activity. Of course, you can also explore the universe of Life on the Swingset, lifeontheswingset.com. A great tool for me when I was starting to sort of figure myself out. And Ryan has, again, completely great insight. So make sure you check that out. Ryan, as always, sir, thank you for being on the show. I appreciate you. Thank you for listening to Detoxicity. I hope you found this particular episode interesting. And if you are new, I hope you go back and listen to all of the older episodes. Once again, my name is Mike Joseph. I am the host and producer of this show. And there are a lot of things that you can do to continue to support our mission, continue to support this podcast. Follow me on social media. I am on Instagram, Twitter, and I'm on TikTok as DetoxPod Guy. You can also send me an email if you'd like. I'm at detoxpod@gmail.com. I am always on the hunt for people with interesting, inspirational, and powerful stories. So if you know somebody who fits that bill, or if you yourself fit that bill, please don't hesitate to drop me a line via email or via social media. Please make sure you subscribe on your podcast platform that you're listening to this on. Rate, comment, help a brother out, help us move up in the rankings. Follow me on social media. Like I said, follow our Patreon, or subscribe to my Patreon, actually. Patreon.com/detoxicitypod. You get access to exclusive episodes. You get episodes a little earlier than the general public. You get a cool ass sticker, lots of stuff. Once again, patreon.com/detoxicitypod. Quick shout out to Calvin Williams for providing the music and doing his magic on the logo, which was originally designed by Jacob Block. I thank you all for listening. I wish you all the best. Please take care of each other. Till next time, peace.